Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or good evening, because some of you are watching from Europe and Asia, where it is evening. Nice to be with you again today. I'm going to begin this morning by addressing a few questions that were left unanswered at the end of yesterday because we ran out of time. And then I'll do a very brief summary of some of the ground we covered last time, and then charge ahead through chapter 7 of the Samdhinimochana Sutra, charging very slowly though, not fast charging, slow charging. The first question is a nice translational question from Vicky Schwartz, and she asks me to repeat and to explain my translation of the Tibetan phrase Ngobo Chikwa Dopa Tadat, and to explain why I've translated the phrase in that way. And I will do so. I'll preface it with a couple of very brief remarks about the activity of translation, having been advised not to go into a long discourse on the philosophy of translation. Maybe we'll save that in case we have time at the very end of the teachings. But just a few quick remarks. There are lots of different translators. The translation of Buddha Dharma into English is very different from what the translation of Buddha Dharma was into Tibetan from India, in that we don't have a single translation bureau and a single lexicon and a single translation practice. Rather, many different translators are at work sometimes in conversation with one another, sometimes in competition with one another, perhaps, but not in coordination with one another. And that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because sometimes you don't know whether two different English words are translating the same Tibetan or Sanskrit expression or something very different. It's also a blessing because it allows a lot of the nuance of the source language, whether it's Sanskrit or Tibetan, to emerge by comparing and setting next to one another the different translations offered by different translators. My own advice is focus on the blessing side and quietly be annoyed by the curse side, but focus on the blessing side because it really can be very, very useful. That's the preface. Now, my own approach to translation and that of a lot of the colleagues with whom I translate, because I often work in groups. Part of my approach to translation is to translate as part of a team. Very often a team of Western and Tibetan scholars working together that kind of imitates the process of the great Lotsawas of Tibet who work together with Sanskrit Pandits. I think you get really good work going that way. But my tendency is when we're translating philosophy and the Western philosophical vocabulary already has standard terms that are roughly equivalent to the terms in the source language, to try to use those terms to make the language accessible to people who are already immersed in these philosophical questions, and to point out that things aren't really so very different, that there are similarities. That can be dangerous because sometimes you can overplay the similarity by translation. But I like to use, when we've got good terminology already and distinctions with which we're familiar, I like to use those rather than to coin neologisms. And in particular, my own view is that if the phrase in the Sanskrit or the Tibetan is not a neologism, then if we can avoid it, it shouldn't be a neologism in English. It should be, if it's a familiar language, familiar term, it should be translated into a familiar term. If it's a technical term, it should be translated into a technical term. If it's a colloquial term, into a colloquial term, and so forth. Was there a question? Sorry?
I didn't know what a neologism was.
Oh, a neologism means a new word that's made up, a new made up word. I try to avoid new made up words. Sometimes we call those, with a kind of snicker, Buddhist hybrid English, when we have to make up new terms in English when we've already got terms. So I try to avoid making up new words unless the Sanskrit or the Tibetan is clearly making up a new word. And that's just a rough and ready rule of thumb to try to keep the translation as close in spirit as I can to the original. Now, in contemporary Western philosophy, we already have this very commonly used distinction. It's a technical distinction, but the Tibetan language is technical too, so that's not a problem. A distinction between intensions and extensions of terms. And I'm going to do that by example for a moment, and then try to explain what I mean. If we consider the two phrases, creature with a heart and creature with a kidney, those are extensionally equivalent. Every creature that has a heart also has a kidney, I mean, unless you've removed it, and every creature with a kidney also has a heart. So they're extensionally equivalent. The set of creatures with hearts is exactly the same as the set of creatures with kidneys. But the meanings of those two expressions, the intentions, are different. It's one thing to have a kidney and another thing to have a heart. And so we refer to that sense of the expression as the intention, the one that's getting at it through a concept, and the range of things that have got the property as the extension. So that's why I use the example of the Queen of England and the most famous corgi breeder in the world. They are extensionally equivalent, but they are clearly intentionally different. That is an intention with an S, not with a T. That's important. And so those expressions mean different things, but pick out the same individual, just like the expressions has a heart and has a kidney mean different things, but pick out all of the same individuals. Now, when we have that wonderful Tibetan phrase, Nobo Chik Ladukpatada, Nobo Chik, right, the same entities, creatures with a heart, creatures with a kidney, right? But Dokpa Tadat, picked out by a different concept, okay? And so we can take that technical term in Tibetan and translate it beautifully and felicitously, I think, into extensionally identical, but intentionally distinct, which is a phrase very familiar to anybody doing Western philosophy. And that maps those ideas pretty nicely. Now, they've been translated in many different ways by many different translators. So some of you are probably familiar with Jeffrey Hopkins' translation, One Nature, but different isolates or something like that. To my ears, that doesn't really mean very much in English unless I know what it's mapping to in Tibetan, because isolate is a real neologism, unless you're doing chemistry. And we don't talk in the philosophy of language or philosophy of mind about isolates in English. So I don't like to use that term. I like to use a term that we've already got. That's not to say that it's wrong. It's just to say that it represents a different approach to translation. And like I say, I'm going to try to avoid a long discussion of approaches to translation. If on the very final day we've got lots of extra time, I'm happy to kick back and talk about that issue, because I think it is an important issue for people who are thinking about Buddha Dharma and its transmission. But for now, let me just say that those are just alternative ways to get at the same Tibetan phrase. Neither of them is right or wrong. They just represent the different approaches of different translators. And the different goals of different translators, and that's perfectly okay. So if I ever, and I probably will continue to do that, use unfamiliar translations, stop me, make me explain why I'm doing it, and I'll usually have an explanation. It might not be a good explanation, but at least it'll be something to try to satisfy you. Does that help? Does that help with that particular phrase? My own view is that's one of those cases where Jay Rinpoche is hit on exactly the same idea that lots of contemporary philosophers of language have hit on. And so if we want to translate what Jay Rinpoche is saying into contemporary English, I like to do that by using the parallel contemporary English rather than making up new words. The idea is the same. I don't think Jeffrey and I are disagreeing an iota about what that phrase means. We're just disagreeing about the most felicitous way to bring it to contemporary English readers. And that's not a disagreement where either of us would argue that the other one is wrong, just that we've got different preferences. kind of like you go into a restaurant with somebody. Well, you can't now, but once upon a time, there used to be the possibility of going into restaurants. And you might go sit down with a friend and she asks you, what's the best thing on the menu? And you just have to say, well, it kind of depends on your taste, doesn't it? If you like really spicy food, think about this. If you like really bland food, think about this. If you're trying to eat healthy, think about this. If you want to really indulge yourself, think about this. And so your preferences determine that. And translation is a little bit like going into a restaurant. When you ask what's the best translation, you want to say, well, it kind of depends on what you're trying to achieve. And I'll leave it there. Any questions about that before I go on to the next question? Okay. The next question comes from the Abbey. And it says this, you, that is Jay, talked about how close the dependent and consummate natures are, but didn't explicitly explain this in terms of how the dependent nature and the consummate natures are both said to be ultimate non-natures. Good point, I didn't. Is the latter presentation implicit in my explanation of ultimate emptiness and emptiness of production? I hope so. And then it says, this is the hard part, we'd appreciate it if you could spell out your understanding of the two ultimate non-natures for us. That's the hard part, because that's really getting into the details. And it's a very fair question and a reasonable question. So let me see what I can do. And there's a little bit of a presupposition here that I want to now reveal, call into question, and make this just a little bit more complicated than the question makes it sound like it is. Because sometimes what sounds like an easy question is really a hard one. And it's often really hard because it's opening a little box of complexities, and you open it and the complexities wriggle out and they get all over the room and it's hard to bring them back together. And the complexity here is all in the word ultimate there when we talk about ultimate non-natures. And so that was kind of sneakily snuck in there by somebody to make an easy sounding question very difficult. So here's why that one is difficult. Because when we're talking about all of these non-natures or naturelessnesses, they really are all part of trying to understand why things are ultimately empty, even if they're conventionally existent. And in that sense, they are all on the ultimate side of things. But when we talk about the three natures, the imagined nature is certainly on the conventional side of things, even if the naturelessness that attaches to it is sort of on the ultimate side of things. But notice it's attached to a conventional idea, right? Let me make that point really clear and do it with care and slowly, so it doesn't sound like I've got something up my sleeve. When we try to map the three natures onto the distinction conventional versus ultimate, as Jay Rinpoche notes in Lekshen Yingpo in the Essence of Hermeneutics, it's easy to see where the imagined nature belongs, and it's easy to see where the consummate nature belongs. The imagined nature belongs with the conventional, and the consummate nature belongs with the ultimate. But when we look at the dependent nature, there's a sense in which we want to associate it with the imagined nature because it's ordinary dependent origination, which we normally put on the conventional side of the world. But there's also a sense in which we want to associate it with the ultimate, because when we understand the consummate, we understand that the dependent is empty of the imagined, that is empty of what's conventionally imputed to it. And that's why that dependent nature is so tricky, right? It's got one face towards the conventional, one face towards the ultimate. That's a hard thing sometimes to hold in mind and to wrap your mind around. But I think of it as a very important part of the Yogacara picture, and a part of that picture that, as I say, Je Tsongkhapa identifies, and then much later in the 20th century, Gajin Nagao a great Japanese scholar of Yogacara, also identified when he called it the pivot point between the other two. Jay Rinpoche doesn't use the phrase the pivot point, but he's getting at something very similar when he says that from one perspective it's conventional, from another perspective it's ultimate. And I think that that's a very, very important insight, and one with which I agree wholeheartedly. But when we talk about the naturelessnesses, things are ever so slightly different. And even though each naturelessness is connected to a nature, we have to be a little careful about associating naturelessnesses with the conventional and with the ultimate. Because all of these are meant to be, as the Buddha says to Paramartha Samudgata, explanations of what we mean when we say that ultimately things are empty. So every naturelessness is kind of an aspect of the ultimate, even though naturelessness with respect to characteristic is attached to the imagined nature. And that, to me, is one of the hardest points of the Yogacara system to get your mind around, that even though the Samdhinirmochana says that the imputational or the imagined nature and the naturelessness with respect to characteristic are the same thing, it's really the ultimate side of that conventional reality, right? Because naturelessness with respect to characteristic isn't what we imagine. It's the fact that things are empty of what we imagine. So that part's really tricky to keep in mind, but important. I'm going to pause to make sure that part was clear, because it wasn't clear, because it's one of the hardest points that I've tried to elucidate so far in these classes. All right, I'm going to try harder to make it clear. I'm going to start big picture and then zero in, and start giving me weird, confused looks as soon as I manage to confuse you. And that's when I'll stop and try to deconfuse you. So, big picture. The three natures, as we've talked about, are each natures of objects of experience, and natures that those objects always have. That part I think we've got. The three naturelessnesses have two broad roles to play. I'm not coming up with a good noun, so I'm using roles to play. One role to play, in their principal role to play, is that they are each meant to be aspects or components of emptiness. And that's really clear from the Buddha's response to Paramartha Samudgata's question. Because what Paramartha Samudgata asked was, hey, Buddha, you walk around saying everything's empty. What did you have in mind by that? And the Buddha says, I'll tell you what I had in mind. I had in mind the idea that things are empty in three senses. And so from the standpoint of this system, of this, the system of the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, sorry, my mouth wants to say the wrong things today. All of the three naturelessnesses are aspects of emptiness, and that means they're aspects of the ultimate. And I think that's really important. On the other hand, they have a second role to play. Each one of them is a naturelessness that is attached to, as I said, and I'm now going to explain what I meant by that, one of the three natures. So naturelessness with respect to characteristic is attached to the imagined nature. And that's because things are empty of the characteristics we imagine them to have. Emptiness with respect to production, or naturelessness with respect to production, is attached to the dependent nature because the fact that things arise from causes and conditions spelled out in the way that we've spelled it out, that is not only external causes and conditions, but also and predominantly psychological or perceptual kinds of causes and conditions, internal causes and conditions, means that they are empty because they're produced, because they're given rise to by causes and conditions. And the consummate nature has attached to itself ultimate naturelessness, which is this complete lack of any thing that could constitute the nature of something, because these things are just put together and imagined to be otherwise. So the three naturelessnesses are meant to match up analytically to the three natures. But we have to understand that kind of attachment as a conceptual attachment. And by that I mean this: it's in virtue of being merely imagined that things are empty with respect to characteristic. It's in virtue of being dependent on causes and conditions that things are empty with respect to production. It's in virtue of being now I have to get a longer sentence here. It's in virtue of the dependent being empty of the imagined that things are ultimately natureless. So the connection is that each nature explains one of the naturelessnesses, not really that they're identical, but that each one explains one. And that point means that every one of the naturelessnesses is really on the side of the ultimate, even when it's explained by something that's on the side of the conventional. Does that make that clearer? Yes, question from the window, the backlit window.
The one problem I have with the explanation of the imputed, imagined type of naturelessness is that the text says, the words in the text are that it does not subsist by way of its own character.
Yeah.
I don't know if that comes to the same point as saying, you're saying that the thing is empty of these characteristics. We put them there, we didn't find them there.
Yeah.
So to say it doesn't subsist by way of its own character seems different.
Yeah, it does. And that brings us back to translational issues, I'm afraid. John chose to use that word subsist, which I would not have used. I would have used the word exist. And he's using by way of to translate an instrumental case that I would have just translated more neatly as with. I think that's just a translational question. And so I don't think we're saying different things. I think what I'm trying to do is explicate that, that particular decision. And I think that if John were to be translating this now, instead of when he was writing his dissertation, he might translate it a little more simply than that. Does that help? I mean, I'm not trying to deprecate John's translation, believe me. I'm just trying to say both are okay. And I'm just trying to give you a slightly simpler gloss of what that means. I think there's a little more technical language in there than there needs to be.
Well, when Jeffrey Hopkins does it, he uses also the word subsist, but sometimes he'll use established, and sometimes he'll use exist.
I know. So here's the deep, dark truth. John wrote his dissertation under Jeffrey. So Jeffrey had to approve this translation. So it's translated in Jeffrey's style, not in my style. And we have different approaches to doing that. The word that's being translated there is drupa, and drupa can mean a range of things. It can mean to exist. It can mean to be. It can mean to be established. It can mean to be proven. It can mean to be accepted sometimes. It's a really wide-ranging accordion term, but very often it's used just to ordinarily mean to exist. And I think there's just maybe a little too much technical emphasis being placed on that in this particular context. But that's just me. If Jeffrey were here, he'd probably argue with me vociferously about that and say that I'm underreading it. I think that's to overread it a little bit, to go from exist to subsist. I don't see anything different there. See, when I hear subsist, I was promised not to talk about translation. All right, but I'm going to talk about it for a moment. When I hear subsist, I hear the notion of being underneath or being foundational. And that's the sub part. And so I hear it as being related to substance. So if somebody said something like Desayupa, right, substantially existent, then I would think, okay, you could use subsist to talk about that. But I don't see that here, where the word is just a very neutral drupa, to exist, which is here a synonym of yupa. And so I think that that's just reading more into it than we need to read into it.
Thank you.
Does that help? No, I'm not saying that I'm totally right about this and that there's not another way to read it. I'm just trying to explain the difference between, what I'm trying to say is I don't think even John is reading much metaphysical into it. I think he's just using the language that was current at the University of Virginia when he was doing his dissertation.
So
Yep.
maybe that follow-up question is then would you say that the way that the three non-natures are spelled out, when Jeffrey Hopkins spells them out, would you say they're consistent with what you're presenting from the sutra?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we disagree at all about the substance. There I go. About the meaning or the content of the text. I really don't. I think we just disagree about the most felicitous way to render those terms in English. And as I say, that's the kind of thing that translators enjoy disagreeing about. I don't think it's a big philosophical issue. I think it's a methodology issue in translation. One way to put that, see, I keep breaking my promise. See, I was told that Thupten Chödrön did not want me to talk about translation philosophy while I was doing this. So, and I don't in general like to be disobedient, but now I'm being pushed into disobedience. So here's one way to understand that difference. Sometimes when you're translating, what you're trying to do is to show your reader that this text really isn't all that foreign, that it's making use of the ideas and the concepts that are already present in your tradition. And you can kind of see that and to give a kind of sense of familiarity so that you're not making it sound really alien. Sometimes when you're translating, it's important to emphasize to your reader, this is really different from anything that you've thought about. You don't want to use the terms in your home language because then you will think that it's more familiar than it is. This is really, really different. You can't translate this into an existing English term. And so sometimes a translator thinks, look, I'm presenting this Asian Buddhist tradition that's so different from anything in the West that I'd better not convey too much of a sense of familiarity where people aren't going to work hard enough to understand it. I think that's more what Jeffrey often does in his translations. I tend to say, you know what? This is philosophy that we can understand, and we might not have offered the same arguments in the West or the same insights, but we've got the same conceptual resources. And so if I can use words that we're already familiar with, I make this more accessible to my readers. And then the ideas might not be the same, but the basic conceptual resources are the same. So I tend to go for familiarity where I can do it. And I think that just represents a difference in sense of mission, maybe. And I don't think there's any reason why you should only read my work and not read Jeffrey's. That would be horrible. Nor do I think there's a reason that you should only read Jeffrey's and not read mine, or Tom Tillemans, or Birgit Kellner's, or John Powers, or Guy Newland's, or any of the many people who translate, each of whom has their own approach to doing this. I like to triangulate and to look at multiple translations together to try to get a sense of where things are. For me, that's important because I don't read Chinese. And so if I'm reading a Chinese philosophical text, I try never to read it in a single translation. I try to use multiple translations so that I can use it to triangulate and get some sense of what might have been underlying that. And I would recommend that people do the same. There are 3 pretty good translations of the Samdhinirmochana. And there's one by Tom Cleary, one by John Keenan, one by John Powers. And you could read the 3 of them together and get slightly different nuance. And that might be a useful thing to do. I would never speak ill of another translator. And that's not a matter of politeness. That's a matter of recognizing A, just how difficult the craft is, but B, just how many good ways there are to translate any text. And the fact that it's not the same as another good way doesn't mean it's a bad way. So that's a little sermon on translations and Lotsawas. So coming back to that question, which I've now only given the background for the answer to, because as I said, it was a tricky question. The question was, would I spell out my understanding of the relationship between emptiness with respect to production and ultimate emptiness? Yes, I will, and I'll do that right now. Notice that the text ties these very, very tightly together and offers very little exposition of how they differ. And what it says is, I'm trying to find the place. Right, on page 101 in the Powers text, the thoroughly established or the consummate nature of phenomena is also an ultimate lack of own being. So he's giving you the identification or the association between ultimate emptiness and the consummate nature. Why is this? Because that which is the selflessness of phenomena, that's a synonym for ultimate emptiness in this particular case, is known as a lack of nature. And because the ultimate's distinguished that way, it's an ultimate lack of emptiness. No, that's not where I wanted to go. That's not where I wanted to go. Page before that, 99. That's where I really want it to be. What's the emptiness in terms of production? It's the other dependent nature. What's an ultimate emptiness? Phenomena that are dependently originated. Here's the point on the top of 101. Phenomena that are dependently originated lack a nature or naturelessness due to naturelessness in production. They also lack ultimate naturelessness. I'm kind of translating as I go along. Why is this? I teach that whatever is an object of observation for purification, right? Dakpa mikpa for people who care about that. I was asked about that yesterday, is the ultimate. Since the other dependent is not an object of observation for purification, it's an ultimate lack of own being. Now, here's what there's actually a mistake in the English there, but you want to say it's not an ultimate lack of own being. So he's associating and distinguishing the emptiness with respect to production from ultimate emptiness. So first the association, then the distinction. Are we together so far? So first the association. The association is that the reason or the explanation of why things are ultimately natureless is that they are natureless with respect to production. That's an explanation. The fact that things depend upon countless causes and conditions, including both external and internal causes and conditions, means that they don't have any essence of their own. They have got no nature of their own. They are selfless. That means that they are ultimately empty. So that's an explanation. Then you say, well, damn, it sounds, Buddha, like you've just said that those are the same thing. That emptiness with respect to production and ultimate emptiness are the same thing. And then he says, no, there's a subtle difference. And the subtle difference concerns whether one is an object of purification or an object of observation for purification. This is a hard phrase to translate into English, or not. And I want to explain what that means now, because that's playing a role here. When we talk about a dakpa mikpa, an object which when you observe it is purifying, that's the idea. We mean something which when you get it, when you see it, when you directly confront it, perceptually engage it, it really results in awakening, right? It really allows you to understand the nature of reality in an immediate way. The analogy that I used yesterday, and I want to return to that analogy because I think it's a good one, though it's not a perfect one, but it's a pretty damned good one, is the analogy that Shantideva uses in chapter one of Bodhicharya Avatara. And there he's talking about the difference. Now it's a different distinction, different context, but this is by analogy. So we're not talking identity, we're talking sort of like, but I think it's helpful. He's talking about the difference between aspirational bodhicitta and engaged bodhicitta. And he says, it's like the difference between somebody who is planning a trip and somebody who's actually traveling. So let me go through the Shantideva analogy in a kind of relaxed way and then bring it back to this particular case. Suppose you're planning to go to Bodh Gaya. So what's the first thing you do when you're planning to go to Bodh Gaya? You get to Lonely Planet and you open it up and you try to figure out where the best guest house is and where the best restaurant is. And you say, okay, Vinod's guest house is really clean and well run, and Muhammad's restaurant has got the best thukpas in Bodh Gaya. So I'm going to stay at Vinod's and eat at Muhammad's. And somebody calls you up on the phone and says, hey, do you know where the best food is in Bodh Gaya and what the best place to stay is? And you say, yeah, I know. It's Vinod's and Muhammad's. And then they say, and what stuff should I see? And they say, well, you should see the stupa, and you do all this stuff, right? And you know that stuff, but you only know it by reading about it. You only know it by inference. And if you already know it, somebody might say, why bother going to Bodh Gaya? You already know what you're going to see. You already know the stupa is really beautiful and powerful. You already know that there's really good tukpa at Muhammad's. You could probably write for the recipe and make it yourself. You already know that Vinod's has a good bed. You could sleep in a good bed here. Why bother going? Well, there's a good reason to bother going. It's really different being there. It's powerful. The experience you have at the stupa is really different from the experience you have reading the Lonely Planet description of the stupa. That's the difference that Shantideva gives you between aspirational and engaged bodhicitta. It's a difference between inferential or conceptual knowledge and real direct, immediate perceptual knowledge. Now, I want to say you can do the same thing here, and not the same thing, but an analogous thing, to see the difference between understanding emptiness with respect to production and ultimate emptiness. Emptiness with respect to production is something you can reason into and understand, and it's really important to reason into it and understand it, just like it's really important to plan your trip. But it's not, when you do that, that's not an immediate direct experience of emptiness that's going to have transformative power. The transformative power comes when you really see phenomena as ultimately empty, as having no self, as having nothing that characterizes them. And that's the ultimate emptiness. So the sutra is saying there's a big difference between just being able to do the reasoning in terms of dependent origination and really being able to apprehend emptiness, even though they're two sides of a coin. When you flip that coin, it matters whether it comes up heads or tails. And dependent or emptiness with respect to production is tails, and ultimate emptiness is heads in that sense. So they're tightly linked, but they're subtly different. And the difference is which one is going to really have transformative power. So that's how I understand the difference and the relationship between those two kinds of emptiness. Does that help? So I'm trying to do it with analogies and metaphors because I think it's really useful here to use analogies and metaphors. Is that a hand in the back? No, it was a scratching of the chin. I've now got it. Okay. So I'm going to move to the next question. I'm still working on questions from yesterday, but that's useful. This one comes from Terensu, and it asks me, is this correct? Ultimate nature is the absence of the imagined nature in the dependent nature. That is correct. But ultimate emptiness is the absence of intrinsic essence. That's also correct. Is this to say that one of the properties imputed in the imagined nature is intrinsic essence? Good question. No, it doesn't follow. It's almost right. And it was such a good inference to draw too, because it sounds like it follows. But the imagined nature, here's a way to put that. All three natures together, right, are the nature of objects as we understand them. But whereas in the Prasangika Madhyamaka system, the thing that we impute in the when we see things as real is intrinsic identity. The yoga, and that's the way to think about it from the side of the object. What we're looking at here is what the subjective correlate is of that, what the subjective side is of the imputation of essence. And so this is an analysis, not an identity. And the analysis of the subjective side of that imputation is saying, what it is we think that the characteristics that we observe and perceive in the thing itself are really in the thing, as opposed to imputed by us. So it's not just intrinsic essence. When I hold up that apple, even though I certainly impute intrinsic identity to it, what we're asking on the Yogacara side is, phenomenologically, psychologically, how do I do that? I do that by saying the redness is in the apple. The smoothness is in the apple. The sweetness is in the apple. The externality of the subject-object duality is in the apple. And you can think of all of this as a kind of analysis of how it is that I go about treating the apple as intrinsically existent. So they're not disconnected, but we really need to hold on to not only the connection between the Madhyamaka perspective and the Yogacara perspective, but also the difference between the Madhyamaka perspective and the Yogacara perspective. And that is the answer to your final question. How could a subject ascertain this through phenomenological analysis? It's by asking yourself, okay, what is it that I think are the real characteristics of that apple? And do I really experience those as imputed, as imagined, or do I experience them as really there? And if I experience them as really there, and I can't speak for you, but I can speak for me, that's how I do it in naive experience, then I really am imagining the apple to be this kind of independent thing. So that's the phenomenological side of the metaphysical imputation of intrinsic identity. It's a subtle distinction, but it's an important distinction. Does that help? I hope. Now, Sagar Rao asks a question. Could we understand the relationship between the three non-natures, the three naturelessnesses, and the three natures as similar to the type of svabhava that Chandrakirti says is ultimate reality itself? I don't want to go there. No. Jay Rinpoche, he says, this is the meaning of svabhava, which Jay Rinpoche says has the three characteristics just like emptiness does. I'm not sure I agree with that either, but honestly, I want to really beg people, really beg you from the bottom of my heart, not to try to quickly map the categories of Yogacara onto the categories of Madhyamaka. We need to see the connections between them, but we can only get to see the connections if we first draw the distinctions. And so I think it's really important to keep those things a little bit separate right now and just to treat these on their own terms. I promise that where I see good connections between the two, I will draw them, but I'm going to try to draw them as connections between distinct perspectives, not as the same perspective. And I think that's important. If they were just saying exactly the same thing, there would be no reason to have a second and a third turning of the wheel. After all, the Buddha had other things to do than just turn wheels of Dharma all the time. And so if he bothered to turn it 3 times, he had a reason to turn it 3 times. And notice that he didn't do it a 4th time, which means that he wasn't just compulsively turning wheels of Dharma and thinking of new things to do. He was doing it for a reason each time. And so the reason has to be that they're a little bit different from one another. Okay. And Tupten Losong asks a question. This is the final one that's in Q&A. The nice thing about this is I don't need to review what I did last time because the questions are forcing me to review it all. So that part we can drop out by the end of this. Said, did I say that Power's translation is lacking a not there? Yeah, I think it needs a not there because the when we say, since the other dependent nature is not an object of observation for purification, it's not an ultimate own being. And I just want to make sure that I'm right about that. Yeah, nobody many chejo. Yeah, so that's just a typo in the translation, and that's important. And it's just a tiny typo, but it's a really important one, isn't it? Yeah, I never noticed it until now. So just pencil in a little bit not there, a little not there. Otherwise, the whole paragraph is incoherent.
What page is this on?
Page 101.
In the book?
Or page 99 on some PDFs, bottom and top of page 100.
So it's that last sentence of that first top paragraph. Since the other dependent character is not an object of observation for purification, it is not an ultimate lack of unbeing, right? Otherwise, it would be an an object of purification. So I think we need a little not there.
Lack, the word lack is already a negation.
But it's not in that sentence. Oh, you're right. The lack is there. Sorry. No. Yep, you're right. He just stuck it into there. I'm sorry. I'm misreading now. So it's not an ultimate own being. Right. Okay. Never mind. Sorry. I was misreading the grammar. I think it's just a slightly tricky grammar. It's okay. Now, sometime between now and then, I'm going to read that really carefully and give you the way that I would translate that sentence. But I don't want to translate on the fly right now. But no, you got a negation there. But that's important. That part's important. Okay. I promised that today we would begin by talking about the similes, the metaphor that is used to explain the relationship between the three naturelessnesses, and then start moving into the kind of what I'll call the pedagogy of the three natures, how they're understood and misunderstood and how they have to be explained, which is all kind of fun. So the example that's given is the great example of a sky flower. Again, a pan-Indian example that we see very often in Buddhist literature, but Buddhists didn't make it up. It's one that we find a lot in India. Curiously, we don't find it in the West. Nobody talks about imaginary flowers in the sky, but I think it's kind of a sweet thing to think about, especially in May when there's lots of flowers around. So the really important thing about sky flowers is there's one really important thing about them. There aren't any, right? That's the really important thing. There are not flowers in the sky. I know that I was once teaching Buddhist philosophy to students, and they were wondering, undergraduates, and they were wondering, why Indian people thought that there were very often flowers up in the sky. And no, the point is that everybody knows there aren't flowers up in the sky. So if you see flowers in the sky, you have to worry about what was in your tea, right? That's the important thing. Okay, so he says, look, emptiness with respect to characteristic, right? That is the one that's associated with the imagined nature, is like a sky flower. Now, again, we have to be careful about how in what respect it's like it, right? And the point here is that sky flowers don't have any of the characteristics we might think that they do. So if you ask yourself, and in fact, they don't have any characteristics, and that's the point. So imagine that your friend is hallucinating sky flowers, and they ask you, can you tell me what color the flowers are? I can't quite tell what color they are. The answer you want to give them is not, oh, maybe they're yellow, maybe they're blue. You want to say, they don't have any color, and there's a reason for that. They don't exist. It's not just that they don't have any color. They don't have any size. They don't have any smell. They don't have any shape. They don't have any characteristics at all. That is, they are empty of all of their characteristics. And that's why we can say that emptiness with respect to characteristic is like a sky flower. Emptiness with respect to production is like the production of that illusion. So your friend then says to you, notice we've encountered an analogy like this before when we talked about the floaters. So your friend says to you, but look, I really see these sky flowers, right? I know that they're there. I just can't tell the details because they keep changing on me, right? I mean, this was really the wrong tea to have drunk, right? And you say, but look, here's what you need to understand. There aren't really any sky flowers there. There are just a bunch of causes and conditions causing you to see something that is not there. Those causes and conditions include the stuff that your friend put in your tea and the nature of your brain and, you know, all of this stuff, but they're just causes and conditions. There aren't really flowers. There's just the production of an experience. And in that way, when we ask, what is it that is empty with respect to production? The answer has to be clear. The sky flower itself is empty with respect to production because it's merely something the experience of which was produced by causes and conditions, not something that exists independently of causes and conditions. Again, I want to point out the difference between that kind of emptiness and the first kind of emptiness we looked at. Really want to tread very slowly through the examples because the examples are beautiful and useful, but only if we spell them out in detail. So remember what we're considering here, what the object of analysis is here. The object of analysis is the sky flower that is appearing to your friend's consciousness. That's the object of analysis. The object of analysis is not empty space where the sky flower is. The object of analysis is not your friend's experience. The object of analysis is not your friend. The object of analysis is the object that's appearing in your friend's consciousness. And that's kind of what I keep wanting to bang on when I say that Yogacara is really giving us a phenomenological understanding of emptiness. We're paying attention to the objects that appear to us as they appear to us, and then using those as the basis for our analysis to come to an understanding of emptiness by understanding the way that our mind apprehends them. So in the first case, the first thing we notice about that object is that even though it appears to have characteristics, it doesn't. Because even though your friend says, my God, now it's red, now it's blue, now it's yellow, it doesn't have those characteristics. Those characteristics are imputed by your friend's drug-addled mind. The second one says, hey, they're not even real because they're simply produced by causes and conditions, none of which is a flower, right? None of which is a sky flower. There are things like your friend's brain, the drugs that were in the tea, and things like that. That's different from saying they don't have characteristics. This is saying they're just the production of a causal sequence. Then the third one, which is the ultimate emptiness, that is, it says, is like the pervasive sky in which it appears. That is, you want to say to your friend, look, where you're looking, all there really is empty space. When what you're imagining to be there goes away, when the causal processes that you have are empty of producing the imagined experience you have, you will just see empty sky. That's what's really there. And that's the ultimate emptiness. So this is an analogy that goes to a slogan that I used to use, and I try not to use so much anymore because sometimes people find it very misleading, is you can think of Yogacara as kind of a drug abuse theory of reality. The world that we live in is not a real world. It's a world caused by kind of adventitious pathologies in our mind that cause us to think that the characteristics we see around us are in independently existent, dualistically related objects when they really aren't. Just as hallucinogenic drugs might make us think that the things that we hallucinate are really real outside of us. We imagine them to be real, but they really depend upon the drugs that have been ingested. And ultimately, there's nothing there at all. And so that is how we can understand this rather beautiful simile of the sky flower. And it's not too far off, because the simile is meant to be the simile of a hallucination, the simile of seeing something that is really not there. Questions about the metaphor. Once again, I think that the great thing about these metaphors is you can put those in your pocket and carry them around. And if you ever say, I can't quite remember how the three natures work, you can say, aha, it's like the cataracts or like the floaters. I can't remember how the three naturelessnesses work. Aha, it's like the sky flower. And then you can work carefully through that analogy, and it reminds you of what you're talking about. But again, the object of analysis is not empty space, even though empty space is what emerges when we understand the emptiness of this. So one way to put that is, if you're trying, and you can see this, this is a really pretty way of getting back to that object of purification distinction between the two emptinesses. Let's take it back there for a minute, because it might nail that point down really nicely. Let's really medicalize this in a terrifying way. So your friend really has, unfortunately, drunk the wrong tea, the one that had the acid dropped in it, right? And so she's hallucinating sky flowers. So what do? You take her to the emergency room, because you know that this is a bad situation. And she's in the ambulance. Okay, so first, before the ambulance, she's seeing sky flowers. That's the imagined nature. That's all she can see, are things that appear to have the characteristics that they in fact don't. And that's all she can see. But there's a really nice paramedic in the ambulance. And the paramedic says, look, don't worry. Those flowers aren't real. They don't actually have the characteristics you think they do. In fact, they're just the consequence of the fact that you accidentally ingested a drug and it's had this effect upon your mind. If you just bear that in mind, you will understand that they don't really exist as they appear. The paramedic has just explained the dependent nature to her, right? It's a bodhisattva paramedic who said, look, these things really don't exist as independent objects because they're just produced by the following causes and conditions. That helps her to calm down, but it doesn't help her to stop seeing them, right? She's still seeing the imagined nature, even though she understands the dependent nature. It's not an object of purification. Then what happens? She goes to the emergency room and they give her the injection of, what is it they use for the antidote? I think it's thorazine. They give her the injection of thorazine, which counteracts the effect of the drug. And now she just sees empty space where she once saw sky flowers. And she says, now I can relax. Now everything is okay. She's now seeing the consummate nature, the complete absence of sky flowers where she thought there were sky flowers. She's seeing a pure negation, and that pacifies her. That's an object of purification. And that's the difference between seeing the dependent nature and seeing the consummate nature. The difference between seeing emptiness with respect to production and ultimate emptiness, even though they're tightly connected. Because notice how tightly connected they are. What did the paramedic say to her? There really is no sky flower. There's nothing there. There's just these cognitive processes. That didn't stop her from seeing it. That just gave her understanding, adding insight to injury. But the real insight comes when she sees nothing at all. That's the consummate nature and the ultimate naturelessness. Does that help? That's a weird analogy. You can put that one in your pocket too, but don't tell anybody that I told you that, because it will ruin my reputation. There were benefits to having grown up at the time that I grew up if you want to teach Yogacara. I didn't say that either. Yes, question in the back.
Yeah.
Is there any, in your little analogy, where is the dependent nature? Where where's the second nature in your little analogy? We had the imagined nature with the sky flower. We had the consummate nature. Where is the dependent nature?
The dependent nature in the Samdhina Mocha analogy, excuse me, sorry, is the production of the illusion. The dependent nature is in the production of the sky flower illusion. So again, think about that as like the cataract illusion, the floater's illusion, that was an illusion for the three natures. The floater itself was the imagined nature. The production of the floater was the dependent nature, right? And the absence was the consummate nature. Similarly with the sky flower, the flower itself is the imagined nature, the characteristics of the flower. The production of the illusion of the flower is the dependent nature. And the absence of the flower, the empty sky, is the consummate nature. And all I did was to make that come to life a little bit by trying to explain how you might end up hallucinating sky flowers if you're not careful. And then how you might reverse that process and why the understanding of the natures can reverse that process. And the nice thing about that is it does help us to understand that very subtle difference between the second and the third naturelessnesses and what we really mean when we're talking about an object of purification. We're talking about something, the observation of which is pacifying. And that's a really nice point. And it also reminds us that philosophy can take you so far, but experience is really important as well. Philosophically understanding that things are empty and that things are dependent isn't honestly that difficult. You know, a pretty smart high school student can get all of that just right. But that doesn't mean that pretty smart high school students, after they read a quick essay like that, are automatically Buddhas. You ask yourself what's missing. What's missing is experience, among other things perhaps. And what the Samadhi is telling us is that experience is really important. That experience has to be the experience of the of ultimate naturelessness, not just the experience of a natureless, of causal naturelessness or naturelessness with respect to production. One of those is an object of purification. The other one isn't. And that part, subtle but interesting. And I think that's really cool. I've got two questions in the back. Three questions.
You get it? What's the meditative process of the third, described in Yogacarya to attain the third natureless?
Great. Thank you for that, because the acoustics were really weird for me from the back of the room. I don't know the answer to that question because the sutra doesn't tell us anything about the specific meditative practices. And I am not a qualified teacher of Yogacara meditation practices. So I have to defer on that one. I'm not trying to be cagey here. I'm just saying above my pay grade as a teacher of philosophy to say what meditative practices would give you that experience. The only thing that I would say is that the Yogacara system, like most Buddhist systems, is replete with many different meditative practices. And I always think that asking what the right meditative practice is kind of like asking what the right item on the menu is. It kind of depends on who you are, where you are, what you need to attain, what's going on, and who your teacher is. And I don't want to tread into those waters right now because I would be a charlatan if I did.
So can I follow on to her question? Is that
Absolutely.
Is that what is the Thorazine in this example? Like, what's the meditative practice? I'd be like asking, what is the Thorazine?
That's right. That's right. And just like, and so maybe the trick that where my analogy breaks down, and analogies always break down somewhere, right? I mean, they're not perfect. Is that there's probably one best treatment for people who have taken hallucinogenic drugs. Maybe I'm wrong about that. My medical knowledge is probably wildly out of date. But even if there is only one treatment for people for hallucination due to hallucinogenic drugs, there's a lot of treatments for hallucinations due to endless primal confusion from beginningless time. And that's why the tradition has so many of those. It's a really big medicine cabinet. And I think you've got to be a really qualified physician to know which drug to prescribe. And that means a really good meditation master, and that ain't me. So I'm not going to try to prescribe drugs to you over Zoom.
What is the conventional truth then? Is it the appearance of the sky flower? Or process?
It's the sky flower. I think in this analogy, it's the sky flower itself, along with its characteristics. So, and then let's be careful, because this is that Janus-faced character of the dependent nature, right? So the imagined nature is the sky flower. Now, as I keep coming back to the real trick about the dependent nature, there's an aspect of it that's very much associated with the imagined nature, with the conventional. There's also an aspect of it associated with the consummate nature, with the ultimate, right? And that's what makes it this very interesting pivot. But if we don't try to think in terms of conventional and ultimate, which is probably not the best scalpel to use for thinking about Yogacara in this context, but rather the imagined, the dependent, and the consummate, right? So add that third term in there. The sky flower itself is meant to stand for the imagined nature. That is something that we experience as having a bunch of characteristics that it doesn't have, that we imagine as having a kind of existence that it doesn't have, and that we treat as though it's fully real, dually related to ourselves, and independent. And the consummate nature, the ultimate truth about that is that the dependent nature that gives rise to it is empty of it. And so you need to think of that dependent nature as something that's kind of mediating here between the conventional and the ultimate. When we think about the dependent nature as it is imagined, we're thinking of its conventional aspect. When we're thinking about the dependent nature as it is, empty of what's imagined, that's its ultimate aspect. And so once again, you can see how it's connected to Madhyamaka, but it's not quite the same. It's a different idea because we're looking from the side of the subject as opposed to from the side of the object. It's also not inconsistent with Madhyamaka. It's just looking at things from a different perspective. We're seeing the world from both sides now. There's a song that goes like that. Yes. I'll wait, question way in the back first and then front row. I'm trying to keep my order. Yeah.
So it seems that in the analogy that the idea of taking the injection is actually altering the other powered nature. And then in the first analogy where we have the operation to remove the hair, so do something, is changing the other powered nature.
Yeah.
Am I just stretching the analogy too far, or is it because of the other powered nature is dependent on causes and conditions, it's an impermanent phenomena, it's changing moment to moment, that changes to it is not problematic?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I just don't know how much I would have paid for that question. That's a really beautiful question. And I think the way that you put it in the second go round was just exactly right. That is, we're not transforming the other dependent nature into something else, but because the dependent nature is a flow of causes and conditions, we can transform those causes and conditions. So to keep with the example of recovering from the accidental ingestion of the hallucinogenic drug, it's the dependent nature that made us see the sky flower, and it's the dependent nature emptied of that imagination, but still the dependent nature that is allowing us to see the empty space that's still being seen through, from the subject side, through subjective conditions. But now what we're doing is and you don't want to stretch it all too far, right? Because if you stretch it too far, it's not going to work. But notice that something causal is happening in each side. The other way to put it which also is in danger of stretching too far. And I just say analogies you've got to be gentle with, right? Because you break them if you stretch them too far. Is that in each case, what we have is an undoing, not a doing, if you understand what's going on right. The operation that removes the floaters, we want to think of as undoing a pathology, not adding something new and adventitious to the eye. And when we do the thorazine injection, even though we're injecting a drug, what we're doing is undoing the effect of another drug. We're negating it or undermining it rather than adding something on top. And it's kind of worth remembering that, because a really important fact about most, now I'm trying to hedge my bets right now because there'll be counterexamples, about most of what happens in Buddhist philosophy is that everything positive is negative. That is, that everything is good is a negation of something rather than a positive addition to something. And everything that's bad is positive, right? When we think of primal confusion, Jay Rinpoche makes this point really beautifully in Sashe Tikchen, in the commentary on Nagarjuna, where he's talking about what primal confusion is. And he says, it's not just the absence of knowledge, it's the positive superimposition of something that is not present in a locus where it's not present, right? The primal confusion, we think of ignorance or confusion as just not knowing enough. And so what we need is more stuff, more knowledge. And Jay Rinpoche is saying, no, what you need is less superimposition. And in the Yogacara system, that's really pretty obvious, right? That the imagined nature is positive superimposition, and you don't cure it by superimposing more stuff. Like now let's take naive superimposition or pathological superimposition, as I like to think of it, and then add Buddhist superimposition on top of it, right? That's not the deal. The deal is that practice is meant to remove the positive superimposition. And so it's doing a negative thing. And I think that's how you want to understand the analogies. But, you know, it's really hard to come up with really cool analogies where every feature is present and none that aren't present are there, right? But that's a really good question. Thank you so much for that one. Then the front row question.
Yeah, so I'm just feeling uncomfortable with this analogy and the way you use the analogy of the taking LSD and seeing sky flowers and so on. It sounds to me somewhat nihilistic, like denying conventional reality. Because didn't we start off saying that things have the three natures?
Yeah.
So it sounds like there needs to be a thing there that has these three natures.
Yep.
But you seem to be pulling away the thing that has the three natures. Maybe
So
I'm
really,
misunderstanding.
yeah, good question. And so I want to say two things about that. One short and one long. I'll say the short one first. That's a really good question. The short one is we have to be careful about how far we torture the analogies, because they are just analogies. And if we push them too far, they break. And that might be a pushing too far, but I want to try to save it anyway. So here's the longer one. And this is one that I think is hard and important. And I'll probably keep saying this in different ways again and again. I said this a little bit yesterday as well, and the day before. When we're thinking from a Yogacara framework, the objects that we're analyzing are objects of experience. The things that we have in front of our minds, the objects as we experience them. So when I'm worrying about my good friend, the apple, who's still here, I'm not thinking about an apple that's independently existent and so forth. Thinking about the apple I experience and asking how I experience it and what its actual nature is. And what I come up with, if I perform the Yogacharan analysis, is that even though the apple I experience has the qualities of being external, dualistically related to my mind, red, sweet, smooth, round, those are not properties of anything that exists independent of my mind. Those are properties that only exist in an objective experience. Because if the apple is seen from another perspective, from the perspective of a bee or a dog or whatnot, it doesn't have those properties. And when I think about the dependent nature and where those properties come from, and the interactions with my sensory organs and my sensory faculties and my sensory consciousnesses and all of that, I recognize that I've imputed those properties to the apple. Now, the sky flower example, or whether we think about it in the way that it's put in the Samdhina Mochana, or the more fanciful way that I put it, but it's really not very different, because if you're seeing sky flowers in ancient India, something's gone seriously wrong too, right? And you need help. The sky flower is meant to be sitting there as an actual object of my experience. Go back to the floaters, for instance, that drove me to the ophthalmologist. The floaters, even though there aren't hairs in my visual field, there aren't actual hairs, I still have experienced floaters, and they're real objects of experience. What makes them real objects of experience, whether from an Indian point of view or from an ophthalmological point of view, is that there's a difference between truth and falsity with respect to them. There are 6 of them, not 600 of them. They're falling from top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. All of those facts, right, that mean that even if there aren't real hairs, there's a real object of experience whose nature I can now ask about. And if I'm hallucinating a sky flower, whether in India or in Massachusetts, the sky flower as an object of my experience is a real object of experience. It has effects. I might be afraid of it. I might enjoy it. I might be amazed by it. I might be confused by it. It might be red or it might be blue, but it's got properties. And so it's got a kind of reality. What bothers you is that I see that sky flower, but nobody else does. And that sky flower might go away, that it doesn't have the kind of reality that we think a real flower has. The Yogacaran idea, this is the scary part, is that the tulips in my garden, when I see them, have the same kind of existence that the sky flower does. It's just different kinds of causes and conditions, different kinds of imagination, and they're a little more resistant to emergency room therapy than the sky flower is. They require Yogacara therapy. Because those two I experience as dualistically related to me, as having the colors that they have independently, the smells that they have independently, and so forth, but they don't. As objects of experience, they're every bit as constructed as the sky flower is. Now, if we move to the Madhyamaka perspective, then we can start drawing distinctions in terms of conventions and the ways of the world and so forth. But then what we're doing is we're looking at those flowers and the sky flowers from the standpoint of the object, not from the standpoint of the subject. That's not to say that we're disagreeing. It's just that if what we're talking about are objects of experience, the things as they're present to the mind, sky flowers are no different from garden flowers. Isn't that cool? That's a scary thing to hold on to. But for me, all right, now I'll speak autobiographically. I think that before I started taking these texts seriously, I would have responded in the same way that you did. And I think I was partly taught to respond that way because I'm taught by Chandrakirti that Yogacara is nihilistic about external objects and reifies the mind. And I love Chandrakirti very deeply. But also because the analogies themselves suggest that in just the way that you thought. And here's the neat thing, that if I see it that way, and I see it as a kind of nihilism, then I get to dismiss it and get to say, well, this is an interesting philosophical system, but it's just a kind of Buddhist straw man. It's just something, it's what you do until the Madhyamaka comes along, right? And then we'll get something that makes sense. But when His Holiness said to me and about 100 other people, don't do that. Take this seriously as an understanding of what emptiness looks like from the side of the subject. And I went back and I said, all right, so I'm not thinking about apples as objects. I'm thinking about apples as I experience them. And I'm not thinking of sky flowers as non-existent things. I'm thinking of them as things that are the contents of my experience. How much of my experience of the world is like a sky flower? And then when I think, oh my God, all of my experience of the world comes to me through my 6 senses, through my 6 sense organs, through my 6 sense powers, through my 6 sense consciousnesses, through my cognition, through my understanding. And I treat it all as though it's just out there as it is. And I do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through my entire life. And that's not what it is, right? That I treat it as something that it's not. And I forget that it's the constant product of a lot of causes and conditions. And that every object I ever encounter is empty of every property I think that it has. Then the floor falls out from under me. And when that happens, I know I've got something going on that's very useful. I come back to Hakuin, right? Hakuin says that realization is like leaping from a great cliff. At first you're afraid, and then you realize that there's no bottom. But I think that if you don't get that queasy feeling of having leapt from a great cliff, then you probably haven't embraced it enough. Buddhism is all about unsettling you, not making you comfortable with your ordinary life. If the Buddha had been comfortable with his ordinary life, he never would have left it, right? And so I really think that even though that reading that you offered of this is nihilistic, because sky flowers are kind of hallucinatory, needs to then get re-examined. And we need to ask just how much of our everyday experience is a kind of cosmic hallucination caused by our tendency to treat our experience as the veridical, truthful delivery of an independently existing world to our minds, instead of the construction of an image that is only an image that we've constructed. I think that's very, very powerful. Later on, when we finally get to Dignaga's Alambana Pariksha, and we talk about Geshe Yeshitapgela's commentary on that text, we'll talk about the fact that this has profound ethical implications. Before we began these discussions, in my very preliminary remarks, I said, I want us to set our motivation. And I want the motivation for thinking about Yogacara texts to be ethical transformation. And I think that as long as we treat the texts as nihilistic straw men, we also fail to open ourselves to the ethical transformation that they can affect. So that's a long answer to your question, but does it help a little bit?
I'll think about it.
Okay. And then push me harder when you've thought about it and you don't agree. And that's okay. Yes, back by the window, all backlit and white.
Forward.
Yeah, it's real helpful to get close to the microphone. It's a good microphone, but it's not a long distance one.
So I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm still not able to see the difference between saying that the imagined nature is us imagining, these characteristics, but the other part of it, of the non-nature, is that they don't subsist or exist or are established by way of their own character. To me, that still seems different than what you're saying, because to be established or to exist by way of its own character is different from me just saying these characteristics I've put them there. I've put them there. We're talking about the side of the subject, but to me, the sutra is talking about the side of the object there.
No, I want, I understand why you're saying that, and I understand the reading. I think you're still trying to read this as a Madhyamaka text being written by other means, as a closet Madhyamaka text. And that's a way of reading it, but I don't think it's a way that the text itself wants to be read.
My reply would be this. So if I throw out all the philosophy, even though I'm knowing that I'm marinated in it all, what I would say is that when I look at dependent origination, I don't care whose philosophy it is, I guess it would be my own, all I see is a flow.
Mm-hmm.
So to say a flow doesn't have any characteristics?
Well, when you say all I see is a flow, I'm impressed because I think it's hard to see that, but it's a wonderful vision. From the Samdhinirmochana perspective, that's the dependent nature, right? And there's a sense in which we all know, either because we've studied a lot of Buddhist philosophy, we're, as you put it, marinated in dependent origination, or because we're just smart enough to recognize that the world that we live in is a constantly changing world of causally conditioned phenomena. You don't actually have to be a Buddhist and have to be marinated in Buddhist philosophy to come to that conclusion, but of course it helps. But when we come to understand that, that's cool. But phenomenologically, and I can only speak from the first person, even though I know that the world around me is just a complicated flow of dependently originated phenomena with no substance and no permanence and no independence, and that I am not standing against that world observing it, but I'm part of that world. I know that, right? I mean, you'd have to be a dummy not to know that stuff. But I, Garfield, don't actually experience it that way. I actually see a bunch of things around me that have this feeling of permanence, this feeling of independence, this feeling of standing against me as objects. And I feel like I am sort of outside of all of that, observing it and experiencing it as a subject. And that there's a duality between me as subject and those things as object. And when I look at my apple, honestly, I mean, I know this is stupid, right? This is true confessions of a completely benighted guy. But I see it as red and round and sweet and existing independently of my mind and having those characteristics all by itself. And even though, no matter how much philosophy I do, and I do a lot of it, right? I mean, they even pay me to do it at Smith. I do lots of it. I still see the world that way. Yogacara is trying to help me there by not, this isn't an examination necessarily of the characteristics of the apple. It's asking me, think about my subjectivity and the way that I'm experiencing the apple. Think about the apple as experienced. And when I do that, I ask, well, what's its nature? The apple is experienced. It's red and smooth and outside of me and all of that stuff. That's its imagined nature. The apple as experienced, that apple as experienced is something that only arises through causes and conditions and is a flow. That's the dependent nature. And if only I were really smart, I would directly see it as empty of all of those characteristics I impute it and think of myself as imputing those characteristics. And that would be its consummate nature. But I don't, right? I can know inferentially, at least me, I'm just talking me, that all of that stuff is true, and I can try to explain it to you, and I can read it in the Samdhinirmochana Sutra. But what Yogacara is trying to do is to say, look at your experience, because your experience is pathological. It's as pathological. That's how I like to, by the way, we're talking translations. My translation these days of klesha is pathology. And when I say that our experience is pathological, I mean it's klesha ridden, right? It's kleshified. It's saying, look at your experience. You're experiencing things through the kleshas, but you're not experiencing as though it's conditioned by the kleshas. And that's what's going on here. I think that's very, very powerful. Why is that? I'll come back to the idea of mind only, of chitta matra. As I said, here's the boring way to think of mind only. You could think, oh, they're saying the only thing there is mind. Here's the more interesting way. Your mind is the only thing you need to worry about. Your mind is the only thing that you're going to be transforming. The mind is the only thing that's causing your problems. The mind is the only thing that you're going to possibly purify. Mind only is doing that, right? Where should you be paying attention? Pay attention to your mind. And I think that's really powerful stuff to remember. And I don't think it's mysterious, and I don't think it's contradictory with anything that we find in Madhyamaka. But what it's doing is saying, when you do that, then when you think about the object of your experience, you need to be thinking about the contribution of your mind. And when you think about the transformation of a world that is, suppose you think about it this way. If you say, well, look, I know that the world is primordially pure, primordially in nirvana, primordially undefiled. But this is the Vimalakirti Nidesha Sutra now that we're talking about. But nonetheless, it appears to me, in the words of Shariputra at the beginning of the Vimalakirti Sutra, as a pile of shit, right? I mean, Thurman likes to translate that as ordure, but you know, it's really pretty clear what he's talking about. And remember what the problematic is in the Vimalakirti Nidesha. Have you guys studied the Vimalakirti? Oh, someday you need to study the Vimalakirti Nidesha Sutra. It's my favorite Mahayana Sutra of all. And it's all about non-duality, but it's a Madhyamaka take on non-duality, not a Yogacara take. But the problematic, it's okay if I digress to the Vimalakirti for a minute. The question that's addressed at the beginning of the Vimalakirti Nidesha Sutra to the Buddha is, how do you purify a Buddha field? How do you take field of enlightened activity and transform it from its impure state to its pure state? Because Shariputra says, hey, you know, like if you're so pure, this is your Buddha field, why does it look like a pile of shit to me, right? And the Buddha's response is really clear. You don't purify a Buddha field, you purify your mind, right? An impure mind sees an impure Buddha field, and a pure mind sees a pure Buddha field, right? And that's what the sutra is all about. Now, I think that's really right. And damn it, that's the heart of mind only, right? You don't go around trying to clean up the shit in the world. You try to clean up the mind that is seeing a rather beautiful world as full of shit. Now that's a radical take on the Four Noble Truths, and it's a radical take on practice, but it's a Madhyamaka take, right? This is a second turning text. And all I want to say is that there's not much space between that and the Yogacara tradition that we are looking at. Not much space at all. What the Yogacara tradition is saying is, okay, let's take that seriously. Now let's ask how we construct that impure world and how we can deconstruct that pure world. We construct that impure world by imagining it to be the way that we experience it. We can deconstruct it by understanding that when we understand its nature is dependent, it is empty of the way that we see it. That's what's going on. Now, what I'm trying to do is connect this to Madhyamaka, but to distinguish it from Madhyamaka. The connection is, it's trying to accomplish the same goal. It's not disagreeing with the conclusions of Madhyamaka analysis. It is locating the fundamental problem of samsara as a problem in our consciousness. The difference is, the only difference is, it's saying, let's look at that from the side of the contribution of our mind to our suffering, not the side of understanding the nature of objects in conventional reality. That's what's going on. And I think if you think about it that way, then you see that it's not, should I be a Yogacharan or should I be a Madhyamika, right? It's not, should I believe what the second turning texts say or what the third turning texts say? This isn't either or. This isn't mutually exclusive. I think the question to ask, right? The question that His Holiness asked us to ask that day in Delhi was, how do you put these together so that you don't disparage any word of Buddha Vachana? So that you see all of this as something that has something to teach us, and you don't treat any of these as Buddha Vachana for dummies. And I think that's a really good question to ask. That's the question that I'm trying to help us look towards an answer to. Yeah. I forget, Chidrin-la, were you there at that teaching in Delhi?
Yeah. I was there at one teaching. It was the year where peoples were self-immolating in Tibet. I don't know.
This was before that. This was an Ashoka Hotel teaching, probably about 4 or 5 years before that.
Yeah, so then I wasn't there.
You should go back and do that one. It was so good.
Do you have a transcript of that?
No, I don't. And you know the terrible thing? I'll tell you a terrible thing. This is what minds do, okay? Especially defective minds like mine. I was so blown away by that part of the teaching, which was only about 10 or 15 minutes of it, that I've forgotten the rest of it, because I found myself just turning that over and over in my mind the whole time. And I'm sure there was stuff I really should have learned from the rest of it that I didn't, but that part just blew me away and has kind of guided my thinking about Buddha Dharma ever since. Yeah.
Do you know what year it was in?
I don't know what year. I'm trying to think. It would have been, let's see, I want to say about 2 or 3 years after his 60th birthday. So that would mean late 90s.
Yeah, okay.
Late 90s, yeah. But I'm not sure exactly what year. And I also could be wrong, because I could be wrong by up to a few years, because as you get older, the years start running together in the past. And the past becomes this amorphous thing that just happened. But it was an Ashoka Hotel teaching, and it was just terrific. About 100 people there. Only because if you were there, I was going to call on you to ask how you remembered that, whether you think that I'm distorting it. But now I can't do that.
But what's interesting is everything you're describing about asking how your mind is contributing to this. For me personally in my practice, I'm doing that already through studying Madhyamaka.
Yeah.
To me, that's what Madhyamaka is making me think of is, you know, what is my mind putting on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's why I want to say these are not contradictory. This is what this is doing. It's a question of where the focus is. It's a question of what kind of question you're asking to get to a similar answer. When I end up saying something that you think is contradictory to Madhyamaka, let me know. But I'm not finding it.
Yeah. No, it's not that it's contradictory. It's I'm still puzzling over how Yogacarya approaches things from the viewpoint of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying that Madhyamaka approaches it from the viewpoint of the object.
Yeah.
And I'm puzzling over that because my experience of Madhyamaka is I look at it very often through the viewpoint of the subject, not the object. So I'm puzzling over what I am missing about the viewpoint of the subject that's supposed to be so prominent in Yogacarya. Because I feel like in some ways that's...
Yeah.
Madhyamaka already. But so maybe that's just my own personal thing. It's not a doctrinal thing.
And maybe it'll get clearer as we go, but let me give you a maybe one more way to try to bring that into focus, which might not succeed, but maybe it will. When I start thinking about emptiness, when I'm thinking with Madhyamaka texts, which I do a lot because my mind tends to orbit around Jay Rinpoche and Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna a lot. The kinds of analysis that I do and the kinds of arguments that I find are arguments that focus on objects of knowledge, shecha, right? And that tell me that the objects of knowledge are empty and explain to me what the relationship is between their conventional existence and their ultimate emptiness. And so when I'm thinking about analytically, what's the focus of my thought? It's the objects.
Okay.
Now, when I'm thinking from a Yogacara perspective, which I do sometimes as well, and I'm thinking, say, with the Samdhita Mochana Sutra or other Yogacara texts, then the question that I'm beginning to ask myself is, what is my mind doing when I'm experiencing? And what does my mind have to be doing to experience? Now, because each of these approaches is aiming at deconstructing and eliminating subject-object duality, eliminating reification. In each case, we're going to have to think about subjects and objects. But from the Yogacara side, the fundamental question I'm asking is, what's my mind doing? And from the Madhyamaka side, the fundamental question I'm asking is, what are those objects like really? And like I said, those aren't inconsistent questions to ask. They get me there from both sides. Chicago, I can get to from the west or the east. Chicago's no different once I get there, sadly enough. But I can get there from either direction. And I don't want to valorize one direction over the other. I want to claim that you get to Chicago either way. That's not the analogy falls apart because you don't want to go to Chicago. But if you wanted to get there, then it would work. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think what it is I think there's two ways to approach Madhyamaka. One is through the way you're doing the analysis, where we're really delving into seeing, dissecting what things are. And the other is the approach of dependent arising. When you approach Madhyamaka from the viewpoint of dependent arising, your mind is part of that dependent arising. And I think that's how I often do it in my practice.
Sure, that's right. That's right. The only footnote I'd put on that, I'm not disagreeing with anything you say, is that even though my mind is part of the dependent arising, usually when I'm doing the kind of analysis that I find in Madhyamaka texts, so thinking about Madhyamaka Avatara or Bodhicharya Avatara, the object of analysis is the object of knowledge. And even though my mind is part of the dependent origination, my intellectual focus is on the object.
But my approach to meditating on emptiness is often through thinking of all the dependent characteristics that came together to create.
Yes.
That. There's where my mind is very prominent in creating what I'm perceiving.
Right. And one way of putting that point is that we're not distinguishing between Madhyamaka and Yogacara on the basis of meditative practice. That's not the Shiduk. That's not the basis of designation. The basis of designation is rather in the philosophical analysis.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a very helpful thing for you to have said.
So I have another question.
Sure.
Usually the traditional explanation, maybe you don't agree with, is that imputed natures are either non-existent or they're permanent. Okay. Now, how is redness or roundness of the apple to me, redness and roundness look like they would be dependent phenomena because they're products and they're changing.
Mm.
And if, so I'm having
Okay. So,
you seeing the imputational
Yep.
nature such that it includes things that are dependent.
yeah. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do, and you know what I'm going to do first, is I'm going to say the traditional explanation. Which tradition are we talking about? And right, right. Okay. So I'm going to say, let's.
Completely disagreeing with that.
Right. Now, I'm not completely disagreeing. I'm saying that there's a reason for making that move. And it involves kind of debate courtyard dripta stuff, and a way of setting Yogacara up as an analytical foil. It also, we could see it as a way of saying, hey, here's a charitable way to put that point now. That was the uncharitable way of putting it. The charitable way of putting it was, so you want to think of Yogacara as a metaphysical system? We can make problems for it. My reply is, that's not the way the tradition itself is trying to set itself out. It's a phenomenological, not a metaphysical position. So here's what I'll do with the roundness and the redness of the apple, and then we're going to need to stop for this morning. But the roundness and the redness of the apple, as they are imagined to be permanent and independent properties of the apple. That's how I think of them when I see them. I think of them as enduring properties of the apple itself. That's the imagined nature side. But when I flip it into emptiness with respect to characteristic, right? The head side of the tails of the imagined nature and emptiness with respect to characteristic coin, then I say, oh my God, they're not permanent actual properties of the apple. They are things that I myself have imputed. So that's why we need the natures and the naturelessnesses, and why each naturelessness is the other side of the coin of the nature. We don't have to ask the question, are they permanent or are they non-existent? The answer to that question can be yes. They are permanent in the imagined nature, and they are non-existent in naturelessness with respect to characteristic. And I will leave you with that thought as an object of meditation while we dedicate the merit. And this afternoon, I will begin with this whole long list of questions that are in the Q&A pile now. I'm just so impressed with how much we've accomplished this morning. We've done one paragraph of the text. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I love working through a text at this level of detail and with this care. And for me, it's such a treat to have people who are patient enough to do that instead of undergraduate students who say, can't we get to the good part?
Will you repeat that last sentence that you're leaving us to ponder?
Yes. From the standpoint of the imagined nature, the redness and roundness of the apple are permanent independent features. That's how I imagine it to be. But the flip side of the imagined nature is naturelessness with respect to characteristic. And from that standpoint, the apple is completely devoid of those properties. They don't exist in the apple at all. And honestly, the most profound idea in Yogacara to me is the fact that each of these natures and naturelessnesses are so intimately tied together as flip sides of the same coin. Heads and tails.
So are you saying that the apple, the redness and roundness are not permanent and independent qualities of the apple? Or are you saying the redness and roundness are not qualities of the apple at all? Or are those two the same, because you're seeing it from the viewpoint of the subject.
Children-in-law, I would say that when you posed the first question, you posed it by focusing on emptiness from the side of the object and tried to ask this in a Madhyamaka voice.
Yes.
To ask it in a Yogacharan voice is to ask, how do I experience it? And where does the nature of that experience come from?
Mm.
And when I ask it that way, I can hold the experienced, permanent, independent properties together with their complete absence in the object.
Mm.
That's the object of meditation for the next few hours. And I expect you all to be fully awakened when we rejoin. Remember,